This is going to be the title of my talk. It's going to be Planning plus Perseverance equals Success. And the reason I decided to talk on that is because I've been reading a book lately by Jim Collins and Morton T. Hansen's called Great by Choice. Well, I've been trying to read the book. It's a business book. So, business books tend to require quite a lot of reflection and generally a lot more intellectual capacity than my brain has at this time of the year. So it's a book on great leaders and how great leaders have built great companies like Google and Amazon and Southwest Airlines, companies like that. And the problem was that the first time I picked up the book, I didn't get past the first line. The first line read, "We can't predict the future, but we can create it." And I thought to myself, is this book going to tell me that to be a great leader, I have to be able to create the future for all the people that I lead? Because that's no pressure there. And I put the book down. And then, despite the fact that I'd put the book down, that phrase, that sentence just kept going around and around and around and around in my head for a good few days after that. And I began to realize that the opening line wasn't necessarily about leadership, or not only about great leadership. It was actually also a lot about what we need to do to create circumstances within which we can achieve success. Circumstances that we can create to achieve success in. And in light of the fact that we've just had an entire school year and tonight's event and the fact that you're going to get reports tomorrow, success is very much on everyone's mind. And I started to link this kind of thinking with about a future that we can create to something that Mr. Aitchison and I often talk to you, the students, about, which is understanding the things that we can control and understanding the things that we cannot control so that we can create the circumstances for success and fulfillment and happiness within our lives. And what are these two circumstances that we can create, that we can control to ensure success? We can control how we plan for success, and we can control how we persevere towards it. And once I'd reached that point in my thinking, I picked up the book again and got further than the first line. So Collins and Hansen, straight after that, they start telling a story. And I thought, this is a great story to share with you guys tonight because it's a true story, and that always helps. And it's about planning and perseverance, and how doing them extremely well resulted in fame and fortune and his name in the history books for one man. But for another man, it showed how poor planning and a lack of perseverance resulted in his death. He died in a big pile of snow a couple of 100 miles out of the South Pole. He is only famous because of his lack of success. The story is about Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott, two adventurers who each wanted to be the first man to discover the South Pole. The North Pole had already been discovered in April of 1909, but the South Pole had not been charted yet. And Scott and Amundsen both had set their sights on this goal. They both led expedition teams in the October of 1911 on a roughly 1,400-mile round trip. 1,400 miles is about 2,250 kilometers, so it's like going from here to Cape Town and back, just less than that. But remember, when we're talking about going to Cape Town, we're not talking about lovely tarred roads. We're talking about snow, ice, and mountains. They left within days of each other in their quest to be the first to reach the South Pole. And what is important to note here is that both men, with their teams leaving in late October 1911, were heading in the same direction, experiencing the same weather conditions, in the exact same extreme environments, working towards the same goal and the same destination. In other words, their circumstances were identical. So how did one man experience spectacular success, but the other man not only failed in his attempt, but died in the process, him and his whole team? Well, quite simply, while the circumstances of the two men were the same, Their behaviors and attitudes towards success, towards planning and perseverance, were entirely different. And while I go into a bit more detail on that planning for you, I want you to begin thinking about your school year of 2019 and ask yourself, did I plan like Amundsen or did I plan like Scott? Only you can answer that question. Amundsen was the type of man who did not believe in luck. A famous quote of his said, "Victory awaits him who has everything in order." When he wanted to learn something, he knew that the best way to learn it was to go to the professionals. So what he did in preparation for his South Pole attempt was he went and he did an apprenticeship with people who have hundreds of years of experience of living and working in polar conditions, the Eskimos. From them, he learned about handling dog teams and sleds, and he learned that dogs are best suited to pull sleds in those conditions. He observed how Eskimos move very slowly so that they can minimize sweating, which could turn to ice. He learned to wear loose-fitting clothing in those conditions so that sweat can evaporate. With the Eskimos, Amundsen trained himself for every possible eventuality that he could imagine on his trip to the South Pole. Scott prepared differently. He did not practice endurance skiing like Amundsen did. He did not learn from experts like the Eskimos. And he didn't even learn how to handle dog teams and sleds. He chose ponies to pull his supply sleds without fully researching what happens to ponies when they operate in polar conditions. And what happens is they sweat onto their hides, and that sweat freezes and encases them in sheets of ice when they start moving. He also chose motorized sleds, even though he knew that they had not been fully tested in extreme conditions. On the trip itself, Scott's motor sled engines cracked in the cold within the first couple of days, and his ponies died a few days later. And that left his expedition party to man-haul the sleds themselves. In other words, the men had to harness themselves to the sleds for the entire expedition. Another stark contrast was in how the men prepared their supplies for the South Pole attempt. Amundsen created multiple supply depots, including a primary depot, which he flagged with 20 black pennants, because black could be easily seen in the snow, at regular intervals, crossing a 10-kilometer width, so that even if they ended up slightly off course, they'd be able to find the supply depot. To speed up his return journey, he also dropped empty packing cases at every quarter mile and put up another black pennant on a bamboo pole at every 8-mile interval. Scott, on the other hand, put up one flag on his primary supply depot, and he left no other markings along his path, leaving himself nothing to save him if he went off course. Amundsen stored 3 tons of supplies for 5 men. Scott stored 1 ton of supplies for 17 men. Amundsen carried enough supplies to carry on 100 miles after they reached the South Pole, just in case they missed every supply depot on the route. Scott carried very little extra, meaning that missing even one supply depot could result in disaster and death. Amundsen carried 4 thermometers for altitude measurement, just in case of accidents. Scott carried 1, and he exploded in anger and wrath when it broke. Amundsen did not know what lay ahead of him in his attempt to discover the South Pole, because nobody had ever done it before. He knew that he had no control over weather conditions or the terrain that he would have to cross. So he controlled every aspect of his plan that he could, to the point that no matter what happened, he and his team had the best possible chance of success. Scott left himself underprepared for uncontrollable elements, and he complained in his diary about his bad luck when things went badly for him and his team. Our luck in weather is preposterous, he wrote. Remember that Amundsen had the exact same weather. It is more than our fair share of ill fortune. On the 15th of December 1911, Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole and planted the Norwegian flag. He then went straight back to work because he knew that he still had to get his team home. He could not know that at that point, Scott's team was a full 360 miles behind them, man-hauling their sleds. More than a month later, on January 17th, Scott arrived to find Amundsen's flag at the South Pole. Just imagine his disappointment after everything his team had gone through. Great God, he wrote in his diary, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without reward of priority. What he couldn't know then was at that point, Amundsen had already reached his primary supply depot and had only 8 days of easy travel left to complete his entire expedition, which he did on January 25th, the exact day he had planned. Scott turned for home as the weather conditions worsened, still man-hauling their sleds through the treacherous conditions, and by mid-March, his expedition stalled, stuck in the snow. 8 months later, they were found frozen in the snow, just 10 miles short of their primary supply depot, which they hadn't been able to find. The same ambitions, the same conditions, the same environments. Spectacular success, devastating defeat. How? The behavior and attitudes surrounding planning and perseverance. So you've heard us say this to you guys. Identify what you can control. Plan the work, then work the plan until the job is done. We are all going now into a much needed rest, and before we know it, 2020 is going to be upon us, whether we're ready for it or not. Like Amundsen, identify your big, hairy goal, and then make your plans, drawing on every resource that you have so that you can work that plan all the way to the success that you want. And how do you begin? Well, that's quite easy. You ask yourself this question: am I Amundsen or am I Scott? Because the answer to that question will allow you to predict the future and exactly what your success will look like. Thank you.